Okay, recording is going. Welcome to week 5. We're halfway there. Very exciting. I know how all we're excited for Monday as well, as we expressed earlier. So for our agenda today, we'll have recap with Rochelle and Natalie on the homework. And then we will do a review session. So this is more so if you have questions, and it's okay if you don't have questions. This week is a short week, so we'll have plenty of time after class as well. And then group learning this week will be on unit tests, and we'll do homework for next week. Let's start by doing our homework recap. I'm going to stop sharing. Rachel's here. And Natalie.
I think Rochelle's going to do the first two, and then I'll do the last one.
Perfect. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I'm on a different computer, so it's taking a moment to let me do this. Let me a second. Oh no, it's asking me to leave the meeting. Let me just try that again to make sure.
If it's a new computer, you might have to leave and come back. But
is it working?
Good.
Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. So I'll show you what I wrote for my trigger first. And is that an okay size for everyone? Okay, I'll take that as a yes. So I guess just looking at the instructions, I noticed that there wasn't really a difference between the behavior that we wanted or the actions that we wanted to take between before insert and before update. So I went ahead and just updated the condition here to include both of those. I don't know if that's best practice or not, but as you can see here, if it's before insert or before update, then it's going to call the handle before insert or update method, which is in my recipe utility class here. We'll open that up. So for the first part, we were asked to create a method that will be called whenever, or sorry, not that part, the second bit here. So if it's missing any of the following fields, to go ahead and check that draft field on the recipe. So here's just that entire, all of those fields listed for equals null. And if that's the case, to go ahead and mark that field as true. And then I also just added, I wasn't sure if it made sense to handle it this way, but I also just added an else statement for the opposite of that to go ahead and change it, uncheck the box. So if those fields were completed afterwards, to go ahead and undo it. And then for the second piece, we wanted to rate the complexity of the recipe. So to basically call out to the helper functions class, the rate recipe complexity, and then get the numerical rating back. So here you can see I first declared the integer complexity returned, and then here passing the recipe argument. I'm not sure if those are the right words to use, but to go ahead and pass the current recipe into that method. And then if it's returning back a 3, to go ahead and update that recipe's complexity field, difficult and so forth for moderate and simple. And then for the last one, I basically was stuck on this until I looked at Natalie's homework. So she will be able to better guide the group on that piece of it. I'll go ahead and stop sharing.
For your helper function, were you able to bulkify it?
I think it is. Because it's still part of my for loop. Sorry, let me just share my screen again. So it's still part of this for loop here. Is that what you mean?
Oh, no, the helper function rate recipe complexity.
Mm-hmm.
We're able to bulkify that that method.
I guess not.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
I'm not sure that was called out in the actual homework, was it?
I think it was called out when you go to the class.
Right.
I think, you'd spent a lot of time. So just curious if people had done it. it wasn't a requirement. It wasn't directly in the homework. No worries, no worries.
No.
But yeah,
Okay.
no pressure, no pressure. Yeah,
No
no,
worries.
yeah, this looks really good, and yeah, it's really good to do the negative version of it. So if one of them is true, then if any of these are blank, then true, else do the false. That's really good, and great use of the word arguments, which was correct. So yeah, this looks really good.
Cool.
Let me see if I can share my screen. Is it sharing?
Yes.
Developer console? Okay, I'm struggling. I'm having something wrong with my VS Code. I don't know if I need to update something, so I couldn't open it up over there. Okay, so for the third method, so it's an after update trigger. So is after and is update. I wasn't sure if I should also have an is insert, but the homework explicitly said just after update, so I just kept it like that within the class. So I struggle with doing things a little too fast, so I really broke down the instructions here within the class itself. So we're creating a task. So first, we got to get all of our recipes because that's what it's firing off of. So we're listing our recipes. We only want it to create that task for that related cookbook if it's not in draft status. So I went ahead and checked for making sure that draft is not true, essentially here in order to add it into my list. Then we just create our list for our tasks later on. So this was really fun doing a junction object. It took me a long time to really understand what exactly I needed to do, but I just essentially started creating a bunch of different lists. I'm sure there is a far more efficient way to do this rather than all these different lists, but it was the only way I could kind of wrap my head around it. So first we're going to get our list for our junction object, the recipe usage. And again, I wasn't sure if I really needed this cookbook does not equal null. If I hadn't waited until yesterday to play around with the homework, I would have kept playing around and tested it to see if it worked without needing that and criteria. But doing the select there, then we're getting back all of our cookbooks for the other part of the related junction object, and then creating our task from that. Sorry, cookbook IDs, and then getting the IDs, then creating the tasks, and then inserting it in outside of the for loop. So I'm sure there's far more efficient way than just creating a whole bunch of different lists.
Yeah, I think if I remember correctly, you could have used dot notation. I've seen a few students do that in the past, but again, you're learning, so you're able to get the job done, which was really good. I love that you did the description at the top so that you know exactly what was going on and what the homework required. You could have done after insert if you wanted to, but specifically, I don't think the homework called out that it needed it. So I think everything looks good. The one comment I had for you is I noticed your variable names are very short and not descriptive. So like, I think you had R, RT, just to make them a little more descriptive when you're reading through.
Yeah, that stresses me out coming up with variable names. I don't know why. Like, I get like paralyzed with I can't be creative, and I don't know.
It's okay. It's just more so like as someone stepping through the code, like reading the code by line, R makes like you come on R and then you go back down to like line 100 and it's like, oh, I'm not sure what it is. So
yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
Just playing devil's advocate, I like short single letter variable names when it's in the scope of a for loop like that, because I can immediately identify that it's a limited scope.
yeah, I
Oh,
think
so
it's
maybe
more so, yeah.
Reserve those for the for loops and not the other variables.
I think
Yeah,
it's more
that's
so like a personal preference. When I was doing like code reviews as a junior, I was always told like as I'm reading the code, regardless of R, L, or S, it doesn't make sense stepping through the code by eyes. And when I do it too, I've noticed that if it's R, it takes me a while to be like, okay, where did this one come from versus if you have a lot of loops and stuff. But overall on the project, how did you feel about the homework? Did you have any frustrations? I know Natalie, you said you kind of waited last minute.
Yeah, I shouldn't have waited last minute. The first two were fine. Like that one, I totally understood what we need to do there is this junction object. And then once you throw in 3 different objects, essentially that you got a query on, like I said, I'm sure there's a far more efficient way than what I did there. But I was just struggling there.
Yeah, junction objects are very tricky. What about you, Rochelle?
Yeah, same. I mean, I basically couldn't get it to work until I looked at Natalie. So that was both like a frustration and also like, oh, okay, I understand, kind of the route that she took, and at least I was able to get it to work.
Good, good. Anyone else in the class have any other comments about the homework?
I tried. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I tried different ways of getting that list ID. So I tried dot notation. The issue that I have is like I get the list which will contain like duplicate ID. So then when I go to test class, it doesn't go through because it recognizes like 2 IDs because I get a list. So because from the test class, they're essentially creating like 2, and they're supposed to link to the same cookbook, so that when I do the cycle, I got a list in which I got the same ID twice. So then when the test class go through, it created 2 tasks. So that test class failed. But I don't know how to convert a list to a set so that I can eliminate the duplicate ID. So that's why I still did.
Yeah, one thing you could have done there too is you could have built a map and defined the key, because with a map you would have gotten you would have had your key and then your values, and your values would have been basically your list. So maybe play around with maps as well. Sometimes when the data is just complicated like that, it might be easier to just build it as a map and define a key for it.
Okay.
And then when you're building the map, you can check to see if you already put this value in here so that you don't get duplicates.
Okay. Does map auto duplicate, like dedupe?
You have to tell it, like, as you're building it, like, does it contain? But I'm pretty sure lists now has a method called dot contains that does similar to what a map would do. I have to look at the logic again. It's pretty new, the dot contains in a list, but you can essentially make a list semi-unique. I say semi because a list can always get another value and then it will just accept it, unlike a set where it will override it.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
And then I think maybe Young, you had a question or a comment?
While I was working on the after update logic, I think maybe there should be more descriptions because if you were to update the receipt every time, with the given logic, it creates the task every time you make update.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if anyone noticed that, because it doesn't give out any condition on a task record. For example, if task already exists related to cookbook, don't create a new one. But I don't think that condition has been iterated on the project logic.
Right. This is really meant to be simplified and basic and not really a complete product. So I think that's a really great call out, because it's something you would definitely want to discuss with users if you were building this in real life. But let's think about how complex that gets now that you've brought that up, because do we say if we've taken care of, if we created the task, assigned it, and took care of it, do we never create a new task? Are there situations where the data could change and a new task would be required, even though a previous task was created and potentially closed, completed? Like, it gets to be vast. And then we spend our time talking about how to best implement a solution instead of just writing the code here in the class. But you're 100% correct. That is definitely what makes sprints so important, because you hopefully have the chance to get back to the users and say, hey, I noticed this. I don't think I have enough detail. Yeah, good call out.
If I may, I forgot to mention that I actually didn't even know how to run the test method, the week 4 homework check. I think maybe we might touch on that during today's topics. But yeah, I basically skipped that part and just did a test in my org.
Yeah, when Bonnie's going through testing, she'll show you a demo as well, but it'll be
Cool.
similar to the same thing, run it in VS Code. All right, let me reshare. And then, so our next, hopefully sharing, yes. Our next part, so are there any concepts that have been a big struggle, confusion during the past 4 weeks that you might want us to retouch again on aggregates or triggers or the non-static static instantiation system methods? It's okay if nothing comes to mind right now, because we can loop back again at the end of class, but just have a think about it. If there's anything you want us to touch on this week, it's more of a review what you're struggling with, or if you have even like a minor confusion. We can loop back again around after class. I think maybe after class you might have more questions.
Constructors came up in the chat.
Oh, I can't see the chat. Apologies.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, specifically what on constructors, Janae? Just constructors in general, or?
Let's just say constructors in general. As I'm going through class or like my readings, if something confuses me, I'll write a note to like ask a question, but sometimes my notes aren't that great. So I don't remember what confused me about constructors. I think I was just reading through code and maybe the note said that this was a constructor and I was like, what does that mean? And so I think I just really, in general, don't understand what they are.
Okay, so let's start high level then as a class. Who can tell me what a constructor is? Let's not all answer at once.
I think it has something to do with like instantiating like when it's non-static. But it's vague for me.
No worries. Oh, what just happened? That was interesting. Okay, yeah. So I was just opening up the developer guide. So that's high level if we're looking at a class and we're looking at this constructor. If we just look at this first line, it's invoked when an object is created for a class blueprint. It means nothing really to us. But if you look at a constructor, basically it's that method that's default that comes with a class. And it's usually, you can tell this constructor because that method is always named after the class. So
that's exactly what was confusing me. I was like, why are these the same? And that's what was throwing me. I'm still confused, but we're getting to where I know at least what I'm confused about.
No worries. We'll keep going through. So if we look at this public class test object, and then we have this public test object, a constructor, when a class is called, this constructor will run once. It's the default constructor of the class. As I was saying, you know that it's the default one because the class and this method is always named the same. And you can have an argument in a constructor, but in this case, it has no argument. So when we're calling our class, we're saying test object my test, and we're instantiating that class. The constructor, if it had some value in here, would run. And what you can use constructors for is to set values. So if we move down just a little bit, this class is a little more complicated and the name is definitely unique. So test object too. So you'll see for this constructor, so we have a private static final integer default size 10, and we have integer size. And then we're going to use the constructor with no arguments, and we're going to set the default size. And don't get too confused on the this notation. Just know that that's used when you're setting constructors. So we're going to skip that part. But what I really want to drive home here is that the default value, which we set as 10 in line 3, it's going to call and it's going to get that argument. But then notice here we have another constructor, set object 2, and this time we're saying integer.object size. So we're going to pass some value to it, and then we're going to say set or size value, which is integer size. We have nothing defined to it right now, as object size. So you could imagine as we go here and we're calling our first line, where we say my object 1, new test object, when we pass this value 42, which constructor do you think it's going to use? Do you think it's going to use the one on line 8 or the one on line 13?
13.
Yes.
13.
Why do you think it's 13?
Because it has the integer something passing into it, which that line has 42.
And if I was to run line 2, what do you think our value would be?
10.
Why?
Because that would be running the code on line 7, which is the default size, which is default size 10.
What do you think?
On line 3.
I was saying, Natalie, do you agree?
Yep. Yeah.
What about you, Janae?
Okay, so here's where I'm getting confused. I agree, and that makes sense because of how like the integer like is called out there, and then the second one on line 2 is blank, and so then it goes to the default and we see the default size equals 10. That makes sense to me, but I'm still thrown off as to like why they're named the same. Like
Because
yeah,
so constructors are very special methods that come with a class. And what we're doing here, and I don't want to complicate it, is these constructors are used to set default values, but also we can overload. And that's what we're actually doing. So as we move down, you'll see we have different constructors that are being called. But the biggest thing to call out for a constructor, it's like the blueprint of the class. So it's basically when you're creating these constructors, they're always named what your class is named.
blueprint. Okay.
It's also, I would like to add, I hope it's not adding to the confusion, but I just want to add that Apex is an object-oriented language, and constructor is just as Nadina mentioned, a special method that is unique to object-oriented languages so that you can have instances of your objects, and your classes are objects in the same way that S objects are objects. So an account, for example, has a bunch of properties, we call them fields, and it has some methods like save and delete. We usually think of those in terms of the buttons on our screen. And when I click on a record, I get an instance of an account that's got the values populated from that record. That's passing in that ID and populating an instance of an account based on the specific ID that I clicked or record that I asked for. I can also click the new button and get an empty instance of that account that I can fill in and save. I can do the methods that are valid on that type of object. So all of those are ways of instantiating. The instance doesn't have to have values, but it can. It doesn't have to receive values, but it can. So, I click the new button. I'm not sending values to the constructor for that account yet. But if I click on the ID value, I am sending a value. I'm telling it instantiate this account using the values associated with this record. So it's the same for your classes. One of the parts that gets misleading to us is that we have the ability also to do static methods, and we can do static methods and instance methods in the same class. And our constructors that we have at the top there, that no argument constructor, it's there by default, whether you define it or not. So if I saw that in your code, lines 4, 5, and 6 in that first code example, I would probably ask you to delete it because it doesn't serve a purpose, and it's a default that exists whether you put those lines in your code or not. Our Visual Studio Code editor gives us that by default, whether we are creating a class full of static methods and no instance methods. It gives us that, so we can go in and delete it if we have nothing to add to make it meaningful, or we can leave it in. And as Nadina said, different places have different coding guidelines and different coding styles, and so you might find that some folks want that bit of code in there regardless. So the constructor is always there, you just might not see it.
High level, it's the constructor because it's named the same as the class.
So what's the difference between the constructor and the method? That when when should we use constructor, and then when should we use the method, the static method or non-static
So
method?
usually constructors, like if we're looking at these that have values in them, you would normally use them in the beginning of the class when you're doing something specific with a class that you want your constructor to run. Because one thing about the public constructors is that the default one, it will run when you instantiate your class. So when you, for example, in this one, when you were doing line 2, that constructor would have run regardless if you had a value in it or not. The fact that you now set it to 10, it would run as 10. So usually people would use constructors or these overloaded constructors where they're adding these arguments to do something very specific, where they want it to run every time they instantiate the class. Now with your static and your other methods that you're adding in the class, you want them to do specific work at specific times. So you don't want them to run every time you create a class, because you have to imagine if this line was called 10 times in your code, each time it would set your default, it would set the default value. It would say, oh, I need to get the default value. The default value is 10. If you call this line 10 times, maybe your integer size was set to say 42, but you called it again and you set it to 45. It would actually override that that variable to now 45. And so constructors are really good at setting initial values on first load of a class, whereas methods specifically, you have work that you want them to do, but you want them to do that work at a specific time. So I always think about constructors as a run when I create the class. Okay, I need to do this specifically, but then if I have anything that I'm doing later on, I would put it in another method, like maybe I need to do some calculation, maybe I just need to do some queries and return a value or a DML or something like that.
So constructors generally are only used when like when it reaches a specific number or something, like when you want it to, and when it's created. But then so when it's initially created and it does something that it reaches some sort of if then thing, if it's greater than 10 or whatever, do something, and the object is created, that's when you run the constructor. And then after that, you generally use other methods. Am I getting it?
Yeah. So I would say more so not even like a if then, it's really when on first instantiation of the class. So the first time you call that class, set these values.
First time call of class. Okay. Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
that if logic would probably be in another method, because you have to think every time that class and that constructor is being called, it's going to keep doing that logic over and over, regardless if you've already done it once. So you can do it multiple times, like if you need to reset some values, for example, but normally you call that constructor once because you're only instantiating that class usually one time, usually.
Okay. That's good to know. Thank you.
And then I can't see the chat. Are there other questions?
Yes, someone asked about trigger recursion, when to use it and for what purposes.
Trigger recursion's pretty, you usually want to use it when you're controlling your class. So you don't want your Apex trigger to run multiple times. So like that example I'd shown on week 3, where we had a workflow updating the record, then updating the trigger. Usually we only want the trigger to do that work once. So a good point for recursion is making sure it's not recursion, making sure it's happening one time in your code. Sometimes you can't control it though, because maybe something else has now re-triggered it, or you have multiple records. But it's usually used that trigger recursion where you had like the static boolean to really make sure you control how many times that trigger is running against every other piece of automation that's running in your org.
And is there any situation where you would pick static Boolean over static IDs? There were like a couple of different ways to control for the recursion.
Yeah, I think that just comes down to preference. Some people will just use a Boolean like yes, no, it's run. Some people will say if these specific IDs have already run through, don't run through them again, depending. It really depends on the use case that you're using. I see the Boolean one a lot when it's just like, okay, I want the entire trigger to run one time. Yes, no, it's run, don't run again. I see the IDs one where it's like, okay, I'm doing these jobs where I might need to run that integration again, but I know new records are coming. So I don't want the trigger to not run, but if these IDs have already run, then that's fine. But if new IDs are coming, then make sure you run these through.
That makes sense. Thanks, Nadiva.
Yeah, and I just want to point out again that the code that we had to work with in the orgs and on our slide deck for recursion was not implemented according to the Salesforce help and training recommendations, and so did not work. It was buggy. And so probably the method that you're talking about, using the IDs to or a static list of IDs that have been already manipulated by that part of the trigger, would be a more effective approach than what we demonstrated in class.
Good follow, Bonnie. Okay, I was able to open the chat. Sci-fi young, you put in there that contains in the list method. Any other bouts of confusion from the previous weeks we want to bring up, or frustrations?
Is it okay to maybe go back to this week's homework? Like I'd like to understand what you asked me earlier about the bulkifying for the calling.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It was actually in the Visual Studios, and this is like the one day I don't have my org open, but it was actually in the Visual Studios. I'll pull it up after class. It was just more so there was like a line in there. It's like, can you bulkify this method? I don't know if anyone actually did it. We had talked about it in class, but it wasn't necessarily in the homework. So I will pull it up after class and we can look through it again.
Okay, thanks.
Let me go through. Let's start our group learning, and Bonnie's going to be driving most of the class today. So let's talk about why do we write tests for our code? Why are tests important? Let's call Rachel.
The risk of sounding like I'm being sassy, but to make sure that the code works.
Well, not sexy at all. I definitely agree with that. Any other? What about Denise? Why do we write this?
I think to avoid issues in terms of from the reading that as you wait to test your code, the longer, like if you wait until it's in production, the more expensive it is to try to fix something. So the sooner you catch it, the better.
I like that. The more expensive it is. Yes, definitely you should always be testing your code. If it's made it to production, it's not necessarily too late, but it's definitely harder to know. One, how it got into production is a whole other thing because you want to essentially make sure all your business logic is being tested, but then two, users are finding errors as they're working, and it probably could have been avoided had you written tests against the code you're working on. So ensure that it's working properly. Rachel says the answer. To catch bugs early, it does get expensive as that code moves on. Regression testing. So confident that the code still works after new functionality is introduced. That's a really big one as you're coding day by day and you're adding on. You might not remember what you wrote 3 months ago, but the test class remember. So it's always good to make sure that you're running all your tests again and just double checking things haven't broken, validations haven't been added to production that now your data might not meet or your code might become invalid. And then you write better code via test-driven development. And Bonnie's a huge fan of test-driven development, so she will spend ages and ages on this. But the point of test-driven development is to write your tests first and then have your code conform to those tests. And as you get better at writing test-driven development, you understand now what you're writing your code for, what's the purpose. And it really helps with revealing weaknesses, edge cases, and things people just hadn't considered as you're writing those test classes. And then different types of testing. There's some different types of testing.
Did you call me out, Nadina?
Yes, I did call you out.
Oh, the ones I'm familiar with are unit tests, user acceptance testing is something we do too. Are you talking about the kinds of test methods like in a test class?
It's more sort of a generic question. We'll get to the next slide on it, but yeah, unit tests are good. User testing is good. How about Young?
I think it says that earlier, regression test.
Good. I figured someone would catch that one. Yes. So yes, unit acceptance testing, end-to-end testing, unit testing, integration testing. So unit testing is for testing your individual small components. Integration testing is for your integrations, things that are integrated with your org. So you're just testing that its functionality is still working. And end-to-end tests always important because you want to test that complete application in its entirety. And then you want to make sure you can, as close as possible, mimic real world use cases. So you might have users in there as well working to make sure things are in that. Usually you use like a full sandbox so that you can test against your production data, things like that. And then user acceptance testing, that's where you're having your users or your client verify that, like, yes, this is working as expected, making sure you're following the business requirements. Also, user acceptance testing is really good because you at the end you'll usually have your power users who can then help also train other users because they're now familiar with the functionality that you built. And then what are key steps for testing? Oh, sorry. I will call Natalie. Oh, wait, Bonnie, did I skip you? I feel like this is your slide.
Oh, that's okay. I'm happy to take over now or take over later.
You can take over now after Natalie.
Oh,
gives us
sorry,
some
it cut
key
in and
steps.
out. I thought I heard an E, but I didn't know it was me.
No worries, no worries.
So you gotta set up your data, run whatever process you need to run. So whether it's a code or workflows and stuff, and then make sure that it's working as you anticipated.
Yeah, it's really good. Bonnie, do you want me to drive? Or
Try to break it. I guess try to break it's also one of them that I always try to tell my clients, please try to break whatever it is that I've created. So you're not just testing for what you know you want it to happen.
Yeah, and that's really important for them to try to break it. Sometimes users or the client is a little timid on working out the code, but then it goes into production and that's where they break it, and that becomes an expensive fix.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. We have always got users who are afraid of technology. They're afraid of breaking things. They don't want things to go bad. If you tell them to try A, B, C, and D, they will do that and keep their fingers crossed that it doesn't break. And what you really want is for them to try not only A, B, C, and D, but also B, D, A, and C in that order and some other order. And if you didn't think about Z, you want them to tell you that you didn't think about, like, I love that you tell them to break it.
Yeah, I always tell my
love
clients, if you come back with nothing's wrong, then you didn't test.
Right.
And that's usually true. When I'm working with my users, they're like, everything's fine. I was like, no, we should have a test together session. Something went wrong here.
So speaking of things going wrong, I accidentally logged in as myself instead of as Rad Coach.
Oh,
And
let
so
me.
I can't share.
Oh, 1 second.
But I have a demo later in the day, so I would like to be able to share.
I will get you and make you co-host.
Thank you. I'm so sorry.
No worries. Did you want me to continue driving the slides to the demo?
I'll go ahead and do it if that's okay.
Okay, perfect. Sharing.
Okay, hopefully you can all see unit tests key steps. Is that showing up for everyone? Awesome. And too many tabs across the top. That's me. Okay, so as you all pointed out, or as Natalie pointed out, I should say, setting up the data and the conditions for the test, calling the methods or making a trigger be fired. So that would be directly calling a method or indirectly calling a method by having a thing happen that causes that method to be called. Basically, creating data that causes the trigger to be fired, editing data that causes the trigger to be fired. Those are all indirect ways of executing your code. Verifying that the results are correct. Yay! I'm gonna call on someone to ask how we do that. Ping-ching.
I think it's the system assert.
Yeah,
equals.
system assert.
Yeah.
System assert or system assert equals or system assert not equals. Personally, I usually just stick with system assert because it's so easy and no choices to make. use it, change it. Beyond the basics, wow, we can test unexpected conditions. Someone already called out the fact that we might have types of tests that are related to the specific methods within our test class, right? The positive test result, that is, does my code do the thing that my code is supposed to do? The negative test result, does my code avoid doing the thing that I want it to do if the conditions don't meet that requirement, right? So we have that missing fields in our homework class. If fields are missing, we set draft equal to true, but we probably want to test that draft is equal to false if the right fields are populated. Testing boundary conditions. So if we have a limit of 200 records that we expect our code to be able to deal with, then what happens when we send it 201? If there's, let's see, the DML limit is 150, if that's right. I don't know. I always Google my limits because they can change. If the DML limits in the org are 150 and I want to make sure that my code is responding or bulkified properly, then I definitely want to make sure I'm testing on 151 records to see what happens. And regression testing. So I want to make sure that if I found a bug, I wrote a test for that bug, and every time I write new code or change my code, I'm not reintroducing that bug ever again. That bug got fixed. Let's not ever see that bug again. And we know that we're not going to see it if we've got regression tests. I love tests so much. It's really strange, but if you've written code, your test is your proof of how you understood that your code was supposed to work. So in 6 months, if someone says, well, this doesn't work, you can say, well, I've got this test, it did work. What has changed? If you've got multiple people putting code into an integration environment and your test works in your dev environment but fails in that integration environment, then you know that it's related to somebody else's code, right? It's not actually your code because your code passes. So there's something else in the org. If an admin turns on validation rules, for example, and your data doesn't meet those validation rules, and so you can't even save your test data, then obviously your tests are going to fail. They don't even have data to run with. So if it works in your dev environment where those validation rules don't exist, it's going to really help you to find that somebody else did a thing that broke your code. So learn to love them because they definitely help you. And I will talk too much about test-driven development if I'm given the chance, but it's a great way to start your code to say, I know I need to write a handler class for my recipes. So I'm probably going to call it recipe handler or recipe util or something like that. And so I can already write a test class that calls that class. And my first method, that's probably going to be something like check values. I don't have to know how I'm going to implement any of that. And I've already got my test that knows that it has to set up a recipe and knows that it has to call whatever I end up writing that's probably going to be named this. So I've already made all the really hard decisions. What am I naming it? And what kind of data does it need? And once you get those hard decisions out of the way, it goes much more smoothly. Okay, so strategies for providing data for tests, because we've already talked about how that's important. Denise,
I think
do you have any suggestions?
The only thing I've seen a couple of times in the orgs I've worked with is just having samples of data in the code.
Samples in the code, yeah, absolutely. Let's see, Catherine. Is Catherine not here? Am I calling on someone who's not here? Or
I don't think she's here.
Yeah, Catherine's
Ah.
not here.
oh, sorry about that. Let me skip down to Rochelle. Are
In
there
the
any-
code is the only.
In the
In the code is
code.
only the way that I've seen it, but I have the slides open. And there's also, you can load data from a CSV or you can use a test factory.
Yeah. So test factory is also in the code, but it's where you have the code living for the creating data living by itself rather than living inside the test. I am a fan of the CSV, and I'm such a fan that I did this Pluralsight course, which I'm going to send you a link for, a long time ago. I'm sure it's still accurate, but who knows? It was done in 2017. With this, you can do your test data as CSVs. So when you have someone who does go in and create new validation rules, you can ask them to update the CSV file to meet that new validation rule. You can ask them to put in the new fields or put in values for those fields that have, a new required field, or I actually worked in an org where an admin reduced our code coverage to 0%. If you've never seen an org go to 0%, you can probably get that done simply by requiring parentheses on phone numbers, because I don't think there's a developer in the world who writes test data and puts parentheses around the area code in a phone number. At least not in the org I was working in. And when I told that admin, she said, well, I'll just rewrite all the tests. And I thought, if only that would work, then she could have her validation rule and the developers wouldn't have to worry about that. Instead, she rewrote the validation rules using the best practice document for phone number validation rules. I encourage you to Google that. And let me post the link to the, if I can find my chat, I will post the link to the, I can't find my chat. It won't show up. I will do that after, at the end of class, the link to the course that I was referring to. But it gives you the chance to then say, to your admins, that's fine. I really want to have meaningful data that looks like what you want it to look like. So let's work together and make that happen. So as we mentioned, test data factory, CSV, and directly in the test methods that are creating it. Of course, this implies that we're using data that's probably going to get saved to the test context. And I think that's a really important thing to talk about when it comes to test data as well. When we run our tests, they don't look at the data in our database. So we have to create new data. That's why we're even talking about setting up data. There are a few scenarios where we can use an annotation on our test methods called CL data equals true. I think Chatter is like the one place, maybe surveys, where you need to actually use that. Some very specific call outs by the Apex documentation itself tells us when we should use that. Otherwise, we should be creating data instead of having our code look at the data in our org. We don't want the code looking at the data in our org because the data in our org changes and is not consistent between production and sandbox, and because Salesforce tells us that they may lift our code, our test code, out of our org and use it in their own hammer test. So when they do their releases 3 times a year, they want to be able to run our passing tests and make sure that nothing breaks with that upcoming release. So if they know that they're making a release change to the way database batchable works, and they know that you've got a test written around database bashable, they may lift your test code out and put it in their org for their pre-release to see if your test still passes. So you want to have non-specific, anonymous data in your test so that those things can happen without any kind of concerns about security or trust breaches. And it also means then that you have a really consistent way of testing your code, whether it's in your dev sandbox or somebody else's dev sandbox or the full sandbox or in production. As we mentioned, we can execute the code either directly by calling a class or method, or indirectly for those code, for any code that's called by a trigger, or any code that's called by another class. So if we have a helper class that has functions that get called in our trigger handler, then of course that helper class is also indirectly being tested. And once we have all of that in place, our test data, our assertions for our test data and our calling our methods, we want to have our assertions. In this case, we want to assert the positive test that we're getting the result that we expected from our code. And we talked about also the negative test. In this slide, though, we're talking about the specific methods around asserts. We do have the assert equals, and the assert not equals. And with the assert, you just set up your condition using a regular condition comparison. So if value equal 1, or using a count aggregation in a SOCL statement and making sure you get the right number of values back from that query, and then putting a message. The message is really important because if you're using these assert statements to prove that your code does the thing it does, you can go back in 6 months and look at your test code and understand what you were trying to achieve. If the message says the handler class should set the draft value to true, then you know that that's what you're expecting your code to do. If it says the handler value should set draft or should leave draft as false when all values are present, then you know that that's what you're trying to do. Regardless of the comments or the state of the comments, hopefully the messages that you're leaving yourself in your test code are going to be helpful in telling you what your code's trying to achieve. With the assert and not assert equals and assert not equals, you pass the expected value and the actual value, and let the assert statement do the comparison for you. Okay, test start test and test.stop test. These are awesome. They tell your code to start the test and to stop the test. And they're also not necessarily necessary in your test code. If you have a really complicated org and a complicated code base where there could be a lot of DML statements or SOCL statements happening relative to what you're trying to test, test.start test allows you to reset your limits specifically for the code that you're testing. So you can set up your test data. You can even do some verification of that test data or run some adjacent code that needs to be run in order to set up the tests that you're trying to set up. And then when you test the method that you're calling, you can put a test.start test before it to wipe out, set the limits back to 0 so that you're just getting the limits on the specific code you're trying to examine. You know, let's think about it. If we're having to set up all of our test data in our test class, that's potentially a lot of stuff that doesn't happen all the time in our orgs. I worked in an org that maintained counties associated with zip codes. For us to set that up each time in our test classes was a pretty complex operation that did call a lot of SOCL statements, did call a lot of DML statements. And yeah, there was just a big business process around that initial setup. So what we wanted to test was all the code that we wrote to work with data that already existed. And test.start test really helps with that. Of course, if you start the test, you want to stop the test. And test.stop test also has its own importance when it comes to any asynchronous processes that we want to run. So if we're doing database batchable, if we're running future methods, if we're trying to send an email even, I think that's an asynchronous process. We want to make sure that our test has test.stop test before we do our asserts, because that's when those asynchronous jobs will run. That's when the email gets sent. It doesn't really get sent, but you would see that the email count gets incremented. With the batchable, you would see that one batch ran with a future method. That future method would run, or that queuable method would run, just because of the test.stop test happening. Okay, that's a lot to think about, but let's get some more simple, if you will, more digestible rules about testing. And that is, make them human readable, make them understandable, make them your first line of documentation for what your code is trying to do, because that's going to help you down the road. When you need to refactor, when you need to add new features, if you can go in and look at your test class and understand what you don't want to break, it makes it much easier to build and elaborate on the code you've got. If you get Martin Fowler's book on refactoring, the first thing he says is understand the test classes, bulk them up, write new tests if you need them, because you know if your test class isn't good enough, and then refactor your code, improve it. Salesforce could come out with a new functionality, new Apex functionality that you want to take advantage of. So you're going to rewrite some of your code. You want to make sure that your test classes confirm that that's still working. Again, the positive asserts, the negative asserts, error handling. So if we've got, if we're throwing exceptions or expecting exceptions to be handled gracefully, we can test and see how that exception is being handled. We want to make sure that we've got good code coverage, not just did I cover 75% of the lines of code in my class, but did I actually cover the business requirement? Did I test that the business requirements are being met by this code, or the technical requirements are being met by this code? So regression tests, as I mentioned, I want to make sure I don't have to fix bugs over and over again. If I fixed it once, I want it staying fixed. And so if it's a bug that's been fixed, there's a test that replicates that bug and passes when the bug is fixed. And that gets run every time that code gets released. We make sure that we're not reintroducing bugs or breaking functionality that our users depend on. And find the errors early. As mentioned, tell your users, break it now. Break it, or you haven't tested it. We want to find that before it gets into production and before it gets harder to fix in the future. And now we're going to do our demo. We're going to look at some code. Okay, hopefully this is readable. Not anymore, because I made it go away. Sorry about that. There we go. Okay, I simplified my week 4 handler and did a test class for it. But before we look at that, we're actually going to jump down here to some new code. We have an ingredient trigger, and the ingredient trigger is running the IUTIL process records, IUTIL being the instantiated version of my ingredient utility class. So if it were just a static method, then I wouldn't have to have instantiated it here, but we're instantiating it with the trigger operation type and the trigger. Oh, we're instantiating it with everything we know about this trigger. So it's very, very thorough in the way it's being used. So we've got our ingredient trigger, and it's looking at the ingredient utility class. So let's go and see what that one's doing. Not the ingredients class, the ingredient utility class. Here we go. It's doing a lot of work for us. Okay, it's going to have a constructor that looks for all of those pieces of information from the trigger. It's going to have a process records method and a check for allergens method and a check for dupes method. So let's see what we can learn from our test class about what that code is doing. It's our ingredient util test, and we've got our first test is test flag non-draft recipe. Now, if I had written this, I would hope that my method name in my test corresponded to a method name in my class. But I don't see that that's the case. So hopefully my method name is descriptive, test flag, non-draft recipe. So clearly it's trying to test something for non-draft recipes, that is recipes that are in their final, they have all their fields filled out. And luckily we have this comment added here. When a new ingredient is added, non-draft recipes should be flagged for review. So if we have a recipe in its final form and a new ingredient gets added, then it should be reviewed. And that is being tested here by creating a recipe. In this case, this recipe should be a draft because it's not complete, it's missing some fields. We add an ingredient. Oops, sorry about that. We add an ingredient related to that recipe ID, and we validate that the recipe is marked as needs review. I'm thinking that's going to be marked as a draft, so I wonder if that's going to pass. Let's run it and find out. No, it failed. If I come over here, test non-flag recipe failed. So probably it didn't pass because I really need to pass in more values. And luckily, I've got values that work in another class over here. That is my, my week 4, what was it called? The one that we just had, the week 4 homework check, is creating a complete recipe. So let's try this one. And see if we can make this test pass. The other thing that makes tests really interesting to me is that you're actually trying to do several interesting technical challenges when you write a test. You're trying to write a test that is valid and meaningful and logical, and you're trying to make sure you're writing code that is valid and testable and logical. So in many ways, your test is testing itself as well as testing this other code. Our test flag for non-draft recipe needs to have data that's not a draft. So let's redo the way the data is set up and rerun this test. I'm going to need to deploy it with its new version. And hopefully not have any problems that I've introduced into the code. And then hopefully this time when I run it, it will pass. Yay, test ran successfully. And that means I get the nice green dot over here, which is what we're always going for with test-driven development. We start with a test that doesn't pass, and we end with a test that does. So awesome. And it's all about how we set up this data. In other words, with this test flag non-draft, we wanted it to not be a draft. And that's where ingredient utility class is set up to run. I'm going to actually close my ingredient utility class and invite you to look at that more on your own as you're prepping for the homework and reviewing this week. I want to actually go back to our week 4 check class. And actually what I really want to go back to is our week 4 handler and the tests that I've written for my week 4 handler, because I want to illustrate some new and different things about writing code. We had our check values method that most of you, I think, had written in 2 parts to step through the list of recipes from the trigger, the recipe trigger, and look for that any missing values in order to set the draft to true if need be. And then often I saw that we were stepping through that list again separately to set the complexity, simple, moderate, difficult, based on the value of the rate recipe complexity code. And I thought, gee, do I really have to do stepping through that list twice, or can I do that just once? And so for my check values, I've got one for loop that loops through the individual recipes. And it does both, it sets a value for both of those fields, the draft field and the complexity field. Another thing I did differently is I used the switch statement rather than the if-then, because it's fun. Switch is a way to handle that sort of multi-step if statement that you all saw, and I thought this would be a great way to introduce it. We've got our helper function that's returning an integer value, right? It returns 1, 2, or 3 based on the recipe complexity, and so I can use my switch statement and have those different values assigned based on when it's 1, when it's 2, and when it's 3 coming back from this method. Does that look pretty much like what you all were achieving with your code? A little bit of a nod from Denise. Sort of a nod from Natalie. That's good. I know that I did this differently. I did it differently on purpose to introduce a new thing for you to learn about, considering whether or not you can do 2 things at once inside the for loop, and considering what the switch statement can do for you in place of that if. Do you like it? Does it look like a good replacement? Is it easier to read? Are the if statements easier to read? It's worth getting to know, but I still need to test it. And I've still got my recipe trigger. It's calling my week 4 handler check values. And so I can use my existing test class to test it. But I thought, heck, why don't we talk about some other ways of testing? So we can use the test setup method to create a record that gets used by every test method in this test class. So once I have data set up using test setup, that means that data is the same and exists in the test context for each and every method. That could be good, it could be bad. Maybe my test methods don't all need that same data, but I wanted to go ahead and give an example of using it. In this case, I'm creating a recipe with just a name. Obviously, fields are missing. So when I insert it, my trigger should fire and the draft should be checked true, right? which means that if I run this test, which I named draft true, so I also didn't name it after my after my handler check values method. The next one I named after the check values method. But draft true is just checking that top part of the method. It's just checking whether or not I set the draft to true when I needed to. And if I run this, hopefully we're going to get a green dot again. We're just running draft true, and it's going to have this test setup data available to it. Looks like it passed. Let's find it here. Yep, draft true.
I'm sorry. What was it that you did just now to run the test? I don't know if it's like a really silly question.
Thank you for asking that. Actually, since this is a test and it's annotated with the @is_test, test setup is annotated with @test_setup, and the test methods are annotated with @is_test before the static void. Because it's set up like that, VS Code knows that it's a test, and it gives me this run all tests at the top, which is actually a link that I can click, and it gives me run test on each of my test methods. So when I click just that, it runs just that test. When I click up here, it runs every test method in this class. And it gives me output here in my output window. You can see I had some tests not passing, and then I got my tests passing, and then I had not passing again. I go back and forth. That's the great thing about test-driven development. You don't feel so bad when your tests don't work because it's just part of the process. Okay, so I have this, and it's working, and it's working a lot like the class that we saw, the week 4 homework check class that we saw running. And so I feel good about that, but I wanted to show you a different way of thinking about the data in your test. So I wrote my handler check values differently. In this case, draft equals true. What I'm really testing is if I create a recipe and it's not set up with all the right fields, does draft equal true? It should, because that's a business rule that I want to make sure is enforced at all times. So I'm not really executing my code. I'm indirectly executing it, of course, but really what I'm doing is I'm creating a record and checking to see what the results of that creation and insertion are. In my handler check values, I'm doing more of a unit test. I'm isolating my code even more, and I'm calling it specifically down here on line 31. This is my week 4 homework handler class and the check values method, and I'm passing a recipe list into it. In this case, I've added 2 recipes to my list, and I haven't inserted any recipes into the database. So nothing else in this org is going to have an effect on whether my code works or not. There's not a validation rule that's going to affect whether my code works. There's not another trigger firing or workflow rule or process builder that's going to affect how my code works, because I'm not touching the database. None of those things matter. I'm really and truly trying to isolate my code in my week 4 homework handler. So I've got my @is_test, static void, and my method name is handler check values. It's creating a list of recipes. The first recipe is my final recipe, so it's got all of the values associated with it. Therefore, draft should be false. I don't have to set that explicitly because that should be the default value based on how our org is configured and our business rules have defined it. And I'm adding that to my recipe list without saving it to the database. Have not done a save. Then I create another recipe record, this one just with the name test draft recipe. Now the draft should be set to true by my code, not by a trigger being fired, not by a workflow or process builder or anything like that. My code, my week 4 homework handler check values should set this value on this recipe on the draft field to true. Now, I've got my recipe list. It's got both of these different records in it, and I pass that recipe list to my week 4 homework handler check values. Now, the magic thing about my week 4 homework handler is that it doesn't care where it gets this recipe list from. It happens to get it from the trigger in this org when things are happening in this org. But for me to test it, it can get that data from anywhere. It can get the data from the fact that I just created these, did not save them to the database, put them in a list, and sent them straight into my handler class. Oh, so beautiful, because I'm truly testing in isolation now. Now, the other interesting thing is that recipe list is, it's a reference variable. So when I send that recipe list to week 4 homework handler, it's actually going to change what that recipe list looks like. It doesn't have to return anything to me. It doesn't have to commit any data to the database itself. It doesn't, we know that. And it does in the create tasks, but I don't have create tasks in mine. So my week 4 homework handler doesn't do any commits to the database. But because this is a reference variable, this data is changed, and we will see, hopefully, when I run the assert, that I'm asserting that draft is, so in this case, I'm asserting that it's not false, therefore true. And that's because the handler should leave it as false. Okay, let's think about that, because it's kind of a complex idea. If I took this not off the front, that exclamation point that negates the statement. So right here, we've got recipe list, the first item in the recipe list, the draft field on that first item in the recipe list. I'm saying it should be false. Well, if it's false, and I'm just looking at a value here, I'm asserting a value here that's false, then obviously my assert statement is going to fail because it's false. But I want it to be false, so I have to put a not in front of it. That's crazy. It's very hard to think about. Let's think about the positive case instead. In this example, with the second record I put in, the test draft recipe, we're asserting recipe list. The second value in my list has a field called draft, and that's true. So when the system.assert statement sees this is true, it's not going to give me my error message. Okay, so we're testing for when the value is false, and we're testing for when the value is true. We want the assert to be a successful assert statement in both cases. We have a successful assertion when the value is false because it's supposed to be false, and a successful assert when it's true because it's supposed to be true. Does that make sense? Ask me now if it doesn't make sense, because I know it's confusing.
I'm kind of confused, Bonnie. I'm not sure how it's marking the draft value when you have not like inserted it into the database.
Right. How is it doing that? Okay, it passed. So clearly it did something different between recipe list 0 and recipe list 1. The primary and secondary recipes in my list. Okay, let's think about that again. Let's look at our week 4 handler. It's getting a recipe list, and it's stepping through each of the objects in that recipe list, and it's actually assigning a value. It's assigning a value to the specific fields that I want to have a value assigned to. So how did I get that back? That's the real trick, right? If I'm not committing it to the database, how does that value come back in here? And that is because it's an S object. When you're working with S objects, the variable is a reference. So there's only one S object in the code stack as that code is executing. It's sitting there, and my handler comes in and says, oh, I need to change this right here on this value. And because there's only one, and everybody's just referencing that same one, it actually changed the value. And same for the second one, where it actually set the value to true. It said, gee, I don't actually have my own copy. I mean, I'm referencing the same copy that the other class had. So it's an important difference between the way S objects are referred to as variables and the way other variables may work. And I think we can also do a quick search of our Apex guide and get the specifics about reference variables and using S object reference variables in this way. But it would also do no harm to come back and save this recipe list and pull it out of the database. It's just that I'm no longer executing a unit test. I'm executing an end-to-end test if I'm giving all of these other processes access to my data. Does that make sense? And end-to-end tests are also really, really great.
You use the word isolated test.
Mm-hmm.
Is it only possible with static method?
No. If I needed to instantiate this, then I would have something like, oh, actually, let's try that.
Like isolated mean you're testing a specific method only, maybe that context?
Isolated means that I'm testing my code without anything else influencing it. Just my code. And in this case, just that one method of my code. In fact, in this case, just the check values on the draft part of my code. I haven't even gotten to writing the asserts for the other part, for the complexity field, but I actually should have written additional system asserts for that part of my code as well. But yeah, I think this is going to work too. Let's run it. Oh, I have to deploy it. I hate it when I run the test before I finish deploying. I never know what's going on. Let me run that again. And it still works. So this is that invisible constructor that I mentioned, right? We have that default constructor because Apex is an object-oriented language. So even without that little bit of empty code that you would have immediately recognized because it would have been a method named exactly like my class. Sorry, I've gone back to constructor conversation, which we had at the very beginning, and we're just going over all the really hard stuff today, and I've gone over. So I'm going to minimize this and get us a little bit further in our presentation today. And then I'll stay on because I've blown everybody's mind, including my own, and I want to answer any questions you might have. Tonight's homework is testing on the Lightning platform Trailhead, just 2 units of that, not more. There's some stuff on LWC. Don't worry about that. Do it if you're interested. Don't do it. Otherwise, there's a lot to do and a lot of concepts. So really focus on generating data for tests and the positive test unit of this Trailhead. For your code practice, you're going to be creating a test class for your week 4 code. And you should have positive tests. You don't have to do the negative tests. You don't have to do it the way I did it, but I've introduced some new ways of thinking about testing as well. But your code's already written, so definitely don't rewrite your code. Just think about how you would take the code that's in the week 4 check and make that code, make a new test class that directly calls your handler class instead of indirectly by creating records in the database. Or you can also do it indirectly by creating records in the database, but it's your choice. And hopefully you've seen how to do that. And as usual, we have our survey. And for your reading, we're going to be talking about data hazards and exceptions. So as you can imagine, we'll then be thinking about how to do testing and exceptions together in the future. But now let's have any questions, especially if there are questions about the code I was showing.
I have another basic question. So I was trying to follow along in Visual Studio Code, and when I open up like week 4 homework class or week 4 homework check, for example, and go to the testing option, like I don't see all the Apex tests. I don't see anything under that component, and I don't see like the links for run tests. I don't know, maybe I blinked and missed part of the setup.
So that's an interesting question. Let me try something real quick. Sorry, I don't need this one. This one's not the one I wanted. I have another. This is the one I did. I set up following the directions, and I just want to see, because I know that it wasn't set up to my liking. It didn't include our scripts, and I use scripts all the time. But for some reason, the repository didn't have that part of the project. And this is going to take forever. And I'm concerned that it might also not recognize so you're saying when you open it up, you get yours looks like this, where it doesn't say run test?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. In that case, then I will recommend that you do what I did, which is I closed this and never opened it again. And I opened a brand new project. So let's step through that new window. Thank you. Yes, open a new window. And I went to the command palette and created a project. Did I say create? What project did I create just then? I don't want to just create a project. Yes, I do. SFDX create project. That's what I wanted to do. It didn't ask me the name of that project, did it? Because it has to activate the extensions for SFDX. I have a very slow setup on this computer, so I'm going to talk you through it rather than doing it. I think it's going to take forever to load those extensions. So you go and create the project and then authorize the org. So you want to authorize your dev org. Authorizing an org is also in your command palette. If you type, it's not going to let me authorize an org, I think, because it's not set up as an SFDX project. But once you've got an SFDX project created, it'll let you authorize an org, and it will give you the default scripts directory in your files. It will give you the run and debug options that you're not seeing. So the scripts are the section that I was using in previous classes for running anonymous Apex code and for executing SOCL statements, for example. And I happen to use that a lot. I find that working in customer orgs, there's always a SOCL statement that I need to keep handy because it's going to give me information that I just always, for some reason, need. And every different customer org is different for what's really interesting and helpful. There's also often some really helpful Apex that might need to be run to clean up data to make certain records ready for a process to run against them or a specific trigger to be fired or something. So for me, this is super helpful. Okay, so I would set up a standard project. I'm calling this, I'm just going to call it show standard project or show standard. And I don't know, I don't think it did that. Create project, standard, there we go. And it's asking me where to create it. So I like to put them in my documents, create the project. And then it sets up my Force app with my scripts folder, and it lets me authorize my org. Command palette, where are you? Well, maybe it's not going to let me authorize an org. Normally, it would then let me authorize an org. I have been having weirdness with my SFDX, and I need to reinstall my Visual Studio Code, I think, because it's not giving me my default org down here either. But hopefully you won't have that problem when you run the setup standard project. And then once you get the project set up, you should also have the org browser. So you can go into the org browser and pull down all of your Apex classes using the retrieve source from org button, which I can't do in the project I just created because it didn't let me authorize, so it doesn't know that the org exists, and I don't have that browser button. Let's see, and we also want our triggers. So we want to pull down our classes and our triggers, and those, I think, are the most important part of what we're doing right away. You can also look through the original project file that you have that doesn't let you run tests. And the other thing that I've seen in the past that has prevented tests from running in VS Code is if I have the wrong Java version set up, or it's not pointing to the Java version. So also check that. And that's what I think might be going on with the weirdness that I'm having in my other org. There is also a way, let me see, let me go over here. There's also a way if I open up my org, oops, to run your tests directly in the org. So let's take a look at that real quick, because I want you to be able to run those tests even if it's not through VS Code. So I can go into the Apex test execution window, and it lets me select specific tests in my namespace. So these are all the test classes that don't belong to a managed package in my org. And I was running the week 4 handler test. And the week 4 homework check is the one that you were interested in. We could run both of those. And it'll give you the little spinny. Sometimes the results are available if you're impatient and you just click on it. My week 4 homework has a failing test. The homework checker is failing because I'm missing, the missing values isn't working, which is a class that I first wrote in there and then said, hey, I should be writing this in my own stuff. And then of course I've taken out the code for those two things. So that's why the homework checks. But my new test is passing, so that's comforting. And for the one that fails, I can also go here and get more information directly. I really like this view, actually. I tend to keep it open and refer to it. It's going to give me a nice readable view of what's going on and specifically where that problem occurred. And so if I have a DML exception or a SOCL error or something like that happen, it's usually going to be revealed in good detail here, exactly where that happened in my code. And that's all here under Apex test execution. And it records, as you can see, it records not just what I'm running from here, but all of the tests that I've been running today are shown in here.
Cool, thank you so much.
Yeah. And for some reason, the tail of Natalie's cat just looked like an octopus tentacle to me.
It's the witching hour. I've been sitting here since 7 a.m. So she's like, yeah, you need to go feed me. Sorry about that.
Awesome. No, I'm sorry we're running over, but I appreciate the patience. And if anybody else has other questions or would like to see anything else, please let me know.
No, actually that walkthrough just helped me because I guess I hadn't authorized the VS Code. Like it had pulled everything over, but it wasn't getting my updated stuff, which is why I did everything in the developer console. And now that just,
yeah.
so now it's working. So thank you. I'm glad
so mine finally loaded all of the extensions and decided to find my default org, which is one of my Trailhead playgrounds, and it's just called Play in the way I've referred to it. So now I should be able to go in and authorize org. What does it say? SFDX authorize an org, yay! And so it'll just ask me if it's production. It is because it's a dev org. I give it a nickname, but I already have that, so I don't need to do that. But I would just give it a nickname and it would then prompt me, oh, I'll do it, why not? It's gonna open a window and ask me to log in. And to be honest, I generally forget my username and passwords because I always use VS Code to log into things. But it's my, we'll see if I remember it. Yes. And normally when you authorize an org, it will prompt you, but if you've already authorized VS Code in that org before, it won't prompt you, right? With the, do you allow this application to access your org on your behalf? So we didn't see that allow, but you might see that. Don't be alarmed. And now I've got my 2021-03 March RAD org opened. And now hopefully I can see I have no Apex tests because I haven't run any. And if I come and, oh, I don't have my org browser. Do I not have my org browser? There's my org browser. I just needed to expand. So with my org browser, I can find all my classes and get the classes, and then it should be able to identify tests, and life should be much easier. It's going to take a while because I'm running on a super slow. And we'll get our triggers. And those should just show up here in my Force app classes and triggers once it's finished retrieving. Look at that. Wow. That's a lot of stuff.
So you can authorize multiple projects in the same org?
Yes, absolutely can. It depends on how you want to organize your work. I have found it useful sometimes to have multiple projects if I'm actually doing multiple projects. If you're tying it to a repository, for example, it's useful. You can also have one project with different code bases in it. So that would be, I think it's in this file. So this file says that my package directory is Force app, but I could have multiple packages in the same project, and they could just be pointing at different paths. You probably don't need to do that. It's probably easier to begin with to just have, and I use a plugin called Peacock because I like it, and it lets me do things like change the color of the background. So now I can more easily tell which one's which. Hey, the purple one's the one I just created, and the blue one's the one I've been using for my demos for the last couple of weeks. And it just makes my life so much easier. And it makes me happy because I like the colors. Okay, so let's see if we got our code down here yet. And if so, I want to run. Okay, so we have classes. Does it see tests yet? Or do I have to run them? It does see tests. Woohoo! I clicked the little recycle button and it updated to actually see the tests that I pulled down from the org. And you can actually run them all from here. With the click of the green button, it will run every test, which is really fun if they all turn green. Maybe not so much fun if I get some red dots. Any other questions while we're waiting for every Apex test in my org to run? Woohoo, we have some code with 100% code coverage. This one probably needs to be upped, that contact trigger. So it ran all of them. It gave me the percentage code covered. It tells me the uncovered line numbers. I really like this tool. And it gives me information about what's passing and what's not passing. And I can just reload these or rerun these tests that are not passing because they show up and they're red. They need to be turned to green. And look, my draft true and my handler check values both still passed. Yay. And of course, it shows up here with the run all tests. So hopefully you can get that working in your VS Code if it hasn't been.
I have a small question about the test setup. The data that was created using test setup annotation,
Yeah.
the lifespan of those test data is only within while running that test class, right?
Yes, it is data that lives for this specific test class. But when you test, the test data context can be irritating. I don't know if you've ever run tests in your org and gotten those, you've gotten tests start failing and it's unclear why. And if you look at the end result in that Apex test execution window, it says something about a locking error. And the way to fix that, if you Googled it, you saw that it said to run tests not parallel. Or you just rerun that test that failed due to a locking error by itself and it passes. So what can happen is that if the same methods in the same class are trying to refer to the same data at the same time, and one of them has a lock, then the other methods could potentially be failing. And I think I've even seen that across multiple classes. If multiple classes are running at the same time, I think that there might be a single test data context that they're all kind of dipping from. So if you've got multiple methods trying to interact with the same exact record at the same time, running multiple tests at the same time, you could find that lock contention problem.
That kind of makes sense because I found, I don't want to say bad thing about our org script, but there is a method that's supposed to be invoked for the campaign trigger, but it's using another S object trigger. So when they run the test together, there is a possibility that it may using the same test method, you know. Something like
that. All kinds of weird, funky things can happen when you run tests. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, you could definitely get locking contention with the scenario like that as well, I would think. And then just rerunning them individually or unchecking that run test in parallel should make that work if you ever see that. Any data that you set up like this inside of your method is only available for that specific method. So that's a good point to mention. Whereas this one it exists now for each of these methods. Any other questions, concerns? We've run way over, so I apologize, but thank you all for your patience, and I'm happy to stay on if there's additional questions. We want you guys to feel comfortable getting the homework done and moving forward. We're halfway through. You guys are doing great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bonnie and Nadina.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a great week.
You too.
Yeah.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.